Three scary Home Alone stories. It was a chilly December night, and I was staying at my uncle's place. It was the sort of place that was too big for a guy to live in alone, and was located almost in the middle of nowhere. And I always wondered how my uncle lived there all by himself. But at the same time, I found it quite peaceful, since there was no one in sight, not a single soul. I was there to finish my novel. Living in New York amidst the noise and overcrowdedness was no good for my writer's block, so I decided to move to my uncle's place till my book was completed. He was actually a pretty decent guy, in his 40s, and he was the sort of guy you don't know much of. And to be honest, no one even knew what he did for a living, and what he even did in life. He had a habit of staying home after the sun went down. I had never actually seen him leave the house after dark in the 2 weeks that I had been there. But that one December night was eerily different. I was alone in the guest room, writing, or at least trying to write a chapter of my novel, but I was distracted by the chilly air and the sound of the rain hitting the window. Suddenly, there was a knock on the door. It was my uncle. He came in to tell me that he was going out. He has some urgent work and would be driving to town. I didn't think much about it, but as he shut the door behind him, I was suddenly surprised at him going out at this hour. He wouldn't leave the house in the dark, no matter what. But I looked out the window, took a deep breath, and began focusing on my writing again, when suddenly I heard the sound of the main door opening. It creaked horribly, almost as if something really heavy was slowly pushing it open. The creak echoed in my ears, and I got really annoyed. I called my uncle from the room that was upstairs, but got no answer. Now I was getting really thirsty, and since no words were coming out, I decided to take a break. I looked at the clock. It was 2 in the morning. I decided to get up from the chair and go downstairs to get myself some water. As I went out and stepped on the stairs, I heard whispers. Not one voice, but multiple voices, hissing and whispering inaudibly. My feet froze. Every hair in my body rose up, and I couldn't move for 10 seconds. Then I tried to peek downstairs. I couldn't see anyone. The whispers suddenly stopped, as if the voices had vanished into thin air. I wondered if my uncle had brought home some company, but then I thought, he's the kind of guy who doesn't even hang out with his family. How could he be socializing at this hour? I then heard something that I could never erase from my memory. It was a peal of horrible laughter, the sort of laughter that sends chills down your spine. Now, as scared as I was, I knew I had to either go downstairs and see for myself what these voices were, or run back to the room and call 911. Calling 911 in a scenario like this would be stupid, because I didn't even know if there were real people downstairs in the living room or what. So I just decided to swallow my fear and go downstairs. But as I stepped downstairs, what I saw was enough to give me sleepless nights for months. 4 tall figures stood in the living room. They were dressed in black from head to toe, and I couldn't see their faces because it was too dark. The only source of light was a flickering light bulb in the corner of the living room. I froze when I saw the figures, and to this day, I thank my stars that their faces were turned to the other way, because one eye contact, and I knew I would have fainted. Just then, I heard them laughing again. They just stood there and laughed. 4 tall black figures were in the living room in the middle of the night. I tried to tiptoe my way back, held my breath for fear of making any noise that would make them turn their heads, and finally reached the guest room. I locked the door, and before wasting a single second, called 911. The few minutes before the police arrived felt like an eternity, and when finally the cops came, there was no sign of forced entry, no clue as to who had entered the house. My uncle came back while the cops were still there, and he just made them leave and pretended as if nothing had happened, or that I was lying. But I know he believed me. He knew I wasn't lying. My uncle passed away 2 weeks after that horrifying night, and I came back home the very next day. To date, no one knows who those tall 4 figures were. They haven't even been caught, nor identified. But even today, the thought of being home alone is enough to send chills down my spine. I was home alone on a Saturday night, as my parents were out of town for the weekend. Being a 16-year-old then, having the house all to myself seemed pretty exciting. Little did I know what horrors awaited. I was on the phone with Max, my best friend, and we had been talking about the new serial killer movie that was coming out. I told him I didn't believe much in that stuff, and he told me how serial killers really exist in our country, especially where we live. But I didn't really buy it. Time passed, and I looked at the clock. It was now 1 a.m. Plus, I was a little sleepy, so I asked Max if we could talk tomorrow. He yawned and agreed. so I hung up and went to brush my teeth. As I came back to my room, I remembered I had left my charger downstairs in the living room. I rushed down the stairs to get my charger and noticed my back door slightly open. Maybe it was the wind, I thought. I shut the door and ran back to my room. It was suddenly chillier than usual. Maybe it's the wind, I thought to myself again. I decided to close the window. When I reached my window, I saw something really strange. There was a man standing on the street. He was wearing an oversized jacket, which made him seem huge and terrifying. I made eye contact with him because I thought maybe it'll make him look away. But no, he kept staring at my window and didn't move. I panicked and immediately grabbed my phone and called the cops. I told them about the man on the street. They asked me if I had any weapons, but I said no. Later I thought he could have easily hidden the deadliest of weapons in the huge jacket he was wearing. But the cops told me to just ignore him. They assured me they'd send a cop car to patrol the street so that he would go away. But that was all they could do. I hung up. After that, I couldn't muster up the courage to look down my window and see if he was still there or not. So I decided to take a deep breath and just go to bed, trusting 911 that a cop car would patrol my street any second. Reassuring myself, I laid on my bed and really tried hard to fall asleep. But my heart sank at the mere image of the man. I couldn't sleep, so I decided to turn. And maybe that was the worst decision of my life. Upon changing sides, there I saw the man, with his huge jacket and blank eyes, staring right through my window. I screamed at the top of my lungs. I screamed and I screamed. And suddenly, the face from the window vanished. Then I heard the police car siren and saw the red and blue lights from my window. I couldn't stay home alone for another second, so I called my next door neighbor and went to his house. I couldn't sleep for 6 whole weeks after that night, and to this day, I keep my curtains closed and windows locked. Because imagine if it hadn't been chilly and I hadn't shut the window or locked my back door. That man would have entered my house, and God knows what sinister intentions he had. My name is Jane, and when I was 15, I used to live in a crappy apartment building with my mom. It was a creepy neighborhood, one that's not safe at all to walk alone at night, especially if you're a girl, and there were a lot of sketchy characters living in our building. My mom had just got a nursing job, but it was an hour-long commute from the apartment where we lived in. She actually wanted a job that was not so far away to save up on travel costs, but she couldn't refuse this one since we were having really bad days and money trouble. Anyhow, my mom used to work all day, and we would walk home together in the evening when I was done with school. Since we had moved into this building, I had always been with my mom, never alone. We had a neighbor who had this weird habit of always sitting outside of his apartment. He would sit there all day and never speak to anyone, just stare blankly at the hall. Sometimes I felt bad for him. He was a man in his 60s, and one day I had seen his rotten teeth, with 2 of his front teeth missing, and that was the day he smiled at me. Out of courtesy, I smiled back, but it was horrifying. That smile was anything but friendly, but then it became a pattern. Whenever he would see me and my mom at our apartment door, he would smile at me. I stopped returning the smiles, and one day my mom noticed him, smiling eerily at me, with his eyes wide open and his teeth missing. She gave him an angry look, unlocked the door to our apartment, and asked me to stay away from him at all costs. The smiling stopped, but now he would just stare at me in a haunting manner. I could feel the weight of his eye on my body. It was horrible, but I couldn't entirely avoid seeing him, since he was our next-door neighbor who was always sitting outside his door. One night, I made the biggest mistake of my life. My mom had the night off one Friday night, so when I returned from school, she was leaving. We met at the door, and unfortunately, our creepy neighbor saw this. My mom said goodbye, and he probably heard it. That is why, as soon as I opened the door of my apartment to enter, a heavy voice hit my ear. It was the neighbor. He had spoken to me for the first time and said, "Is your mom working tonight?" And that's it. That was the grave mistake I made. Without thinking much, I naturally said yes. Only after the words left my mouth did I realize what I had done. Anyways, I immediately went inside. I locked the door behind me, then I fixed myself a quick dinner, had a sip of Coke, and decided to take a shower. As I was in the shower, I heard a really strange noise coming from outside my bathroom. It was really loud. I thought there must be some construction going on, but the noise was not coming from too far away. Then it got louder. I quickly rinsed and put on the clothes I had in the bathroom and went outside. The noise was coming from my room, and as I stepped closer, it suddenly stopped. At first, I thought someone had entered the apartment, so I looked around. I could feel my heart sinking, but saw no one. But then I heard the sound again, and it was actually coming from my room. As soon as I stepped out in front of my room, it stopped again. I can now feel my heart bouncing. I looked around again, but there was no sign of a person. But as soon as I was about to take a sigh of relief, I noticed something. There was a hole drilled in my wall, right beside my bed. I went closer to it, and with shivering hands felt it. It was rather tiny, so I kneeled in order to take a look at it. And what I saw still gives me nightmares. It was an eye. A big, bloodshot eye was looking at me through the hole, and it made me jump back. I immediately ran to the living room and called the cops. I called my mom as well, who said she would get home ASAP. But thank God the cops were there in 5 minutes. Our neighbor was arrested for stalking and criminal mischief, and my mom's friend who lived around the block came immediately as my mom had phoned her. But that night was so terrifying that the mere memory of it makes me break out in cold sweats and send shivers down my spine.